Hello and welcome to the first ICAEW Insights podcast of 2023. I'm Philippa Lamb. This time we're exploring what 2023 might hold for the UK economy and, of course, the business world. Now, while 2020 and 21 were dominated by the urgency of the pandemic, last year was altogether different. A raft of economic and political pressures collided at home and abroad, and uncertainty is still the universal watchword as we look at the year ahead. Many of the trends that kick-started 2022, inflation, rising interest rates and stalling growth, are expected to continue. But for how long and how significantly? And what fresh surprises might the new year bring? So for a spot of expert crystal ball gazing, I'm joined by the same team of guests who reviewed last year for us in our Christmas episode. Francis Haque, Chief Economist at Santander UK, Iain Wright, ICAEW Managing Director of Reputation and Influence, and David Williamson, Political Editor of the Sunday Express. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, look, you all did sterling work reviewing and analysing 2022 in our last podcast. Before we look ahead, shall we assess where we are now? And briefly, Francis, where are we economically?
I would say in a downturn, if you want to be brief about it. But yes, things are not looking rosy from a growth perspective, let's say. But hopefully, looking forward, the markets will remain calm, which obviously they weren't doing in 2022, and things will start to improve towards the end of the year.
I should say at this point we are recording this just ahead of January, so you'll have to bear with us if we miss any significant events that happen in the meantime. But David, politically, where are we?
We're in a position where there's a young, thrusting Conservative leader who's got a giant majority, and there is a great confrontation with the forces of the left in the trade unions, showing a new degree of militancy. Now, and those actually are the type of situations that I think a lot of people who dream of becoming Conservative MPs think, wow, that's a great battle for the ages. And they think back to Thatcher's era and think, wow, this could be the propulsion for great things in normal circumstances. Problem is, this isn't normal circumstances at all. And there is this chasm of an opinion poll lead that Labour has over them. And it isn't that there's been a transformation in how the public perceive Keir Starmer, but it's rather been that 2022 has been a case study of how to sabotage a party that has weathered spectacular storms in the past. And Rishi's mission really is to whether or not he can stop the water coming in and get it to a safe port of shore in time for next year's elections, which are looming so close in everybody's minds. Partly because of self-interest as well, because if you think that the economy is very bad and that your party is getting the blame for everything and you're likely to lose your seat, the employment options, to be blunt, for a lot of MPs are going to be quite difficult. So one MP said to me, if by March things haven't narrowed, it's going to be a fight of every man for himself or woman for himself or herself.
So they'll jump ship?
Not just jumping ship, but just going into pure survival mode, and the type of febrile frenzies that we have seen producing very unpredictable results over the last 3 years could manifest themselves in new ways.
Yeah. Iain, business sentiment, you track it. Where is it?
It's low. It's in negative territory. We're probably not at the bottom of that. If you look over a 20-year period, because that's how long ICAEW has had a business confidence monitor index, we're not in 2008 negative territory when confidence was really, really low. But there's been a sharp trajectory fall from the heights of real optimism coming out of the pandemic. We're on a par now with sort of pandemic levels, Philippa, and we're on a par with that uncertainty that was happening round about 2019 as the UK was coming out of the European Union and what that would look like. But we're probably, as I said, not at the bottom. 2023 we'll see much sharper falls. And actually, we're probably in recession as this podcast goes out.
What do we know, Iain, that will happen in 2023? Have we got, do we have key events that we know are in the calendar?
I mean, in terms of what the Bank of England might do, I think businesses are factoring in further interest rate rises, certainly in the first half of 2023. In terms of general economic policy, what's really interesting is how government is trying to use regulatory policy as a big, significant arm of economic growth policy. 2023 will mark the 5th anniversary of the Carillion crisis, and audit reform has still not been finalised. I know we've had a global pandemic, but are we going to see some sort of resolution when it comes to audit reform and corporate governance changes? But also there could be the prospect of regulation of the tax profession. And what's going through, it's just actually finished, the House of Commons at the moment, is the Financial Services and Marketing Bill. What does our financial services sector, an incredibly important part of the UK economy, something that we're world class at, what does that look like post-Brexit? And so making sure that some of the regulators have an object in law to push forward our competitiveness as a sector for the UK economy over the medium term. As I said, the UK government will be trying to use regulation as a means of driving forward competitiveness.
And David, politically thinking, we've got local elections coming up.
Well, we do in May, and it's still technically, I suppose, midterm-ish. That means that we'll probably have party sources giving absolutely dire predictions. Local elections are fascinating. It's the one thing where the parties compete to have the worst possible predictions, and so that any surprise win is then held off as a triumph that the rest of the nation is swinging behind.
Indeed.
Yeah, so there'll be probably lots of attempts to extrapolate that. But actually, to be honest, the real results that probably Rishi is going to be more worried about are going to be economic indicators and not necessarily things like GDP, because in a way, suddenly house prices are like the personal GDP of a household. It's how wealthy and how well off people feel. And we have a generation that's been on this incredible exercise in putting faith in the law that house prices in Britain now always go up and that interest rates are low, and it's a crisis of faith. It's a thunderclap psychologically.
Yes,
which so many people between the ages of about 25 and 55 are suddenly grappling with this incredible change. And to be honest, if they have the sense that their own GDP is going through the floor, that's going to be the biggest worry for any party that wants to stay in power.
So a real psychological risk there. And obviously, zooming out, we've got big events rolling on this year. We've got the war in Ukraine continuing.
It's going to have such a determinative effect. There are people who are optimistic about this year. And one of the key reasons for optimism is if Ukraine can be resolved peacefully, if it looks as if Russia is looking for a way out, and if somehow in this game of awful four-dimensional chess, if some way can be found that allows some sort of soft landing. But at the same time, I think there's an equal number of people who are fully aware of the potential for nightmares to be realised on a scale that we've never seen in Europe since World War II.
And the Northern Ireland Protocol, that's still under negotiation?
It is. And you wonder if it's the type of thing that will be under negotiation for years to come. But recently there has been a little more optimism. There is a sense that the Biden administration might be perhaps playing a more positive role, actually seeing there's a deal to be done. Problem is every side, whether it's Europe or Washington or London or Dublin or Belfast, every side had actually some political gain from a bit of a conflict over this issue because they were able to play to different bases on this. But there's a new Northern Ireland envoy appointed, which is seen as a very positive step that can grease the wheels a bit. And also Macron's had his election. And yes, and Sunak, I think, very much wants to project a more positive, can-do, pragmatic, problem-solving thing. So when we're faced with so many problems that we have absolutely no ability to solve, to actually get a win in the book would be great. And it's also tied into domestic UK politics in a very real way, in that Northern Ireland doesn't have a functioning government, and for so much of its recent history hasn't. And there is the mantra of defending the Good Friday Agreement. But in Northern Ireland, there is certainly the sense of, well, we do need a functioning democracy.
So, Frances, if we're thinking economically, perhaps globally and then closer to home?
Yeah, so I think globally, I mean, we're expecting a slowdown. And, that's inevitable, I think, in terms of the US economy. Weathered it much better than the UK one. But equally, the feeling is there will be a mild recession there and in other places, and therefore that And obviously China is having a problem as well. So you sort of put all of it together and you think from a global perspective that will be challenging. And of course, despite the fact that there is this push for deglobalization, we are still all very much a global market. So any effect of a slowdown in other economies will of course affect our own economy and our ability to trade. But in terms of closer to home in the UK economy, I mean, this year is going to be difficult, and I'm sure that everyone feels that as well. It's been very interesting. I think we might have noted this in the last podcast, but around savings and things like that, that people have, we all thought that people, and I think businesses too, thought that those savings would start to be spent. Well, they haven't. The people are holding on to them. And that generally suggests they're very worried about what might happen. And also, we know from credit card data, people aren't putting as much on their credit cards. So they are genuinely worried about how they're going to pay for all these things. So from this year, I think, spending will be hard. Having said that, inflation obviously is the area of probably most concern because we don't know what's going to happen to energy prices. The hope is that they'll obviously start to flatten. They won't increase. They'll start to flatten and then fall back, and that will obviously help inflation. But equally, we need to look more internally at our, what's happening to wages in the UK, and is that going to drive inflation too? Because that is, I think I said in the last podcast, very difficult for the Bank of England. Then they'll feel it's more necessary if that's increasing to keep going with bank rates.
It sounds like that's what you think is going to happen.
In a normal recessionary environment, you would expect the labour market to start to ease. And that's the question. Is it going to ease? Because we've got problems with inactivity. So long-term sick has increased immeasurably. And we know early retirement has been increasing. But could it be that early retirement, actually that reverses because people need to come back to work because they need the money in order to be able to live? That's an interesting question. I think on the long-term sickness side, it's very difficult because I suspect a lot of that is connected both to, long COVID, but also to long wait lists. And it's going to take time, obviously, to get through those. And very interestingly, a piece of work actually that someone in my team has recently done, which is focusing on the fact that these long-term sick are younger people. I mean, that should be a serious concern to all of us because, given that we have an ageing population, if we've got even younger workers out because they're not able to, go to their jobs because they're sick, that's a real problem for the future. That's a real shift.
Back in the day, it was musculoskeletal was the key driver of absenteeism, wasn't it? Now it's mental health.
Mental health a lot of the time.
And the age demographic much lower. As you say, yeah, that's a big change. I mean, Iain, business conditions, we've obviously got the energy crisis very much still with us.
If you look at our economy in quite simplistic terms, in line with other mature Western democracies, our economy is based upon domestic consumption. And certainly in the UK, our domestic consumption, if you're a homeowner, has had the backdrop of cheap credit, cheap interest rates, and expectations of ever rising house prices, feeling that sense of well-being and prosperity. That seems to have gone. Higher interest rates, possibility, if not happening already, of house price falls means that people don't feel confident in the future and therefore won't invest maybe in a larger house, a conservatory, home improvements, that sort of thing, won't spend money. Linked in with that, of course, is people don't have the money to spend. Energy prices, inflation in general has meant that level of disposable income has been cut to a very, very low level. So, the factors of economic growth in the UK have been very much curtailed and will continue to be so through 2023.
And last year, Iain, we talked about the cost of doing business crisis, didn't we? I mean, that's certainly persisting on various fronts.
Well, I was really interested in what Frances was having to say about the labour market. And the UK's labour market is incredibly tight. I think I said in the last podcast, throughout 2022, businesses were telling me, we don't have the staff. We could grow a bit further. We could do a bit more, but I can't get the staff. I think that tightness will probably remain. And I think what the Bank of England, the governor and the chief economist have been very strong in saying that inflation was not invented in the UK. Of course, we imported it through Ukraine, through supply chain difficulties. But it might grow up throughout 2023 here in the UK, the second round effects of wage claims, and, quite understandably, with a 10% inflation rate, people want to get high pay claims. That tightness of the labour market, you tend to get a pay increase more or less when you move jobs. So people might be looking to move jobs to get that higher wage. So I think you're going to see some element of that come through.
But as you say, we're starting the year with industrial action across the board.
Yes, the unions are concerned about changes to terms and conditions, as well as that cost of living crisis. And there will be a battle between employers and government on that. What's interesting, though, is to what extent for certain sectors of the economy, whether that might not have had the impact that it might have had pre-pandemic, because people can work from home. If you're on a construction site, you can't. If you work in a supermarket, you can't. But professional and business services can be quite mobile. I'm speaking to you from Northumberland. I go to London, but I don't have to go to London all the time. I just wonder whether we'll see that really embed. People thought that it might have been a long-term factor, but I just wonder whether it's going to be really, really embedded now.
Yeah, that structural change. I know you have a thought about that playing into levelling up.
Well, I just wonder, the house price issue is a factor because I don't think there's the level of demand. But, and again, this is very simplistic, bit stereotypical really, Philippa, but, you could be sat, 2-bedroom flat in London, and then you could go and buy, quite a substantial country pile somewhere else, Yorkshire, the northeast, that sort of thing. People would be very tempted about if I'm in my stage in my career, I could still do work. I can work from home. I can use the broadband and Wi-Fi, but I don't have to be in London. If you're slightly older, you're slightly more advanced in your career, you might be able to do that. That might have an impact in terms of levelling up. What we've seen since the pandemic, we saw it very clearly in the regional factors of business confidence monitoring, was London drives the UK economy traditionally. Its position as a global city means that it, in terms of productivity, it just helps propel our economy forward. Hasn't done that from COVID onwards. People are not going into London quite so much. They're not spending in the bars, the sandwich shops, the restaurants. People aren't tending to go to the theatre, even with a relatively weak pound, and the tourist market. The growth in regions tend to be outside of London, and I wonder whether that could be a sustainable factor in the future.
Yeah, Francis, all the things that Iain's been talking about there, that plays into the commercial property market. We've talked about residential, but
I think the view for that is relatively bleak, certainly over the next year. And it'll be interesting. What will be interesting is how companies are able to deal with that and what are they going to do instead? I can only give sort of anecdotal evidence. Back in Wimbledon, which is where I live, we've actually seen more office space come through because I think there's more demand for it at a regional type level, if you see what I mean. Rather than going into London, you're using it more locally, which is, of course, helping local businesses. But equally, you're also seeing a lot of change of use of other spaces. So, in particular, retail sort of turning into more social type use. So whether that might be, gaming and things like that for the younger generation or more sort of restaurants and things like that. But it's quite interesting. I think it's, going back to Iain's point, it's going to be quite different, I think, for commercial property depending where you are. And I think London might struggle more than perhaps in other places. You might see better regional outlays rather than, where we are in London.
And of course, that's a very segmented sector, isn't it? When you think about, regional distribution warehouses, all that you would imagine would do quite nicely with our digital economy, but it's the urban holdings, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's what use do you have? And that will be interesting to see whether that starts to get switched. Because, we know that there's been a lot of warehouses, for example, who obviously have developed over the last, 18 months, really. There's been a real push for that to meet demand because people are obviously buying a lot more online. So it'll be interesting. I would have thought a lot of change of use maybe needs to come through.
So, David, the Sunak government, what can we expect?
Yes, I think maintaining stability will be one of the number one things, absolutely. It's a bit like how for most people, they don't wake up in the morning and start thinking about the future of their politicians. But it's a bit like when you get on a train, and this happened to be the other day, or a tube. Suddenly, it's a journey you've done hundreds and hundreds of times, and the thing starts swaying from side to side, and you suddenly think, well, actually, do you look at the driver when you get on your train? Or what's going on here? And I think there's a feeling that the British people have had an experience of a lot of swinging from side to side, and if they simply have a beautiful, smooth journey, that will be a great success. And I think there has been very much, certainly in the last few weeks, an attempt to actually take the drama out of politics. I think Rishi Sunak would be very happy if other stories lead the Today programme, for example, for quite a while, because it isn't a sign of a very stable democracy if there's a constant sense that it might erupt. And people love these little phrases that come through. But just as whoever coined the term Brexit, if they copyrighted that, would be a billionaire by now, the phrase which was creeping in recently was bristly, which is the idea...
Say again?
Bristly.
Right.
There's this idea that Britain is becoming Italy, that we are changing our leaders regularly, that the constituent parts are thinking very seriously about breaking up, which...
fragmentation, yeah.
Absolutely, which again is a major thing, which if Rishi has any spare bandwidth to think about, he does need to think seriously about Scotland, and also about how to manage the whole border poll question in Northern Ireland, which will come onto the agenda in a big way sometime probably in the next 5 years. So if he can simply have a Britain where people might have the hope of a summer holiday, his one advantage, actually, is that Monty Python says no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. We are expecting horrendous monsters behind every door.
Yes, our expectations are low.
We're in a jittery state. And if he manages to get through to spring, and we do see optimistic economists regularly talking about, well, actually, maybe things might not be quite so bad.
Green shoots. Yeah.
Exactly. Of course, the problem was John Major's green shoots that became a sense of parody, which dogged the tail end of his government lead up to the 1997 landslide. But if those green shoots actually do emerge, he will put the microscope on them, and actually a lot of people will breathe a deep sigh of relief.
Okay, quick round table. Biggest hope, biggest fear for the year ahead. Francis.
Well, my biggest hope is I'm wrong in my forecast,
Right?
And I don't often, say that.
No.
So, but yes, that would be my biggest hope. But my biggest fear is actually one of the strike action, and just how long that might go on for, because that really feeds into people's sentiment. And that would be a worry, because the economy really drives on confidence. We've heard Iain talking about business confidence. It's so important, and it's at record lows. And I think things like strikes just don't help. And let's hope we don't have any blackouts either.
Yes, it's all a very visible sign of the problems we know are there, isn't it? Because you're encountering strikes and industrial action in your day-to-day life, wherever you are. David.
Probably hope and fear is actually probably both are centred on Ukraine, because if there is an expectation that during the winter things may calm down simply because of the strategic thing of its intensely cold weather, and the hope would be that actually that isn't just a climactic thing, but is actually a strategic thing with somehow some resolution that leads to a speedy peace. The fear would be that Putin actually responds to his own internal pressure and feels the need to have one more giant heave, and which could be cataclysmic. And there is the fear that in terms of worst case scenarios, we have not seen anything what could happen on that degree yet.
Yes, that would be the end of your talk of a stable year, wouldn't it?
It would be.
Iain, biggest hope, biggest fear?
They're both the same thing, Philippa. My hope and fear is inflation. I hope that you see a spike in inflation and it comes down fairly rapidly. David's talk about the Ukraine, about making sure that, some of the supply of energy is addressed. That would be my hope. My reading of history is that inflation doesn't act like that it hangs around. It's a real negative and corrosive force, harming everybody, particularly those that were most vulnerable
Francis
in terms
is
of
nodding.
economic situation. But it harms every business. It harms every citizen. And as I said, the lessons of history show that inflation hangs around far too long. So I hope that the bank and others can get inflation firmly under control. It's not entirely under the bank's control, but we really do need to tackle inflation for the good of the economy, for the good of business, but actually for the good of 60-odd million people in this country.
Iain, Francis, David, thank you very much for joining us again and sharing your predictions. It's not an easy task right now. We're grateful.
Oh, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
As always, the ICAEW Insights podcast will be staying on top of events that matter to finance professionals with news and analysis throughout this year. You can catch the next Insights podcast in early February. Join us for that. Meantime, please do rate, review and share this episode and subscribe to ICAEW Insights on your podcast app.